Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Writers Are People Too podcast, where you might just find that you shouldn't meet the writer of your heroes. So today we have with us actually an entire anthology of authors. Everybody can wave, say hi. I'll get to each of you in turn. And so this anthology is titled Augmented, Volume 1, put out by Quoir Publishing. And so it's 19 stories, over 200 pages. And it looks like we have 6 of the authors from the anthology with us tonight. And so this is a science fiction anthology near and dear to my heart. I love science fiction, reading it, writing it. I love everything about it, look into the future. But before we go into the anthology, let's actually have each of you just go down the list and brief introduction to yourself.
My name is Matt Downey. My official publishing name is Marta Elias Downey. I'm actually a theologian by training. I have my PhD in dramatic theology, and I was a pastor in an urban church for over 20 years. But my basic love is story. I love telling stories. I love reading stories. I love all the inner workings of stories. So that's what I like to do.
Okay, awesome. Keith, go ahead, please.
My name is Keith Giles. I'm one of the co-owners of Quoir Publishing and helped put together this anthology. And I also have a story in the anthology as well. And I'm also an author and written a bunch of things, mostly nonfiction kind of stuff, but love science fiction. It's kind of my first love.
Awesome. Darrell.
Where do I start? Well, in the 90s, I worked in the theater, writing plays and training actors, and then I had other kinds of writing, and then I sort of fell into poetry, and that's where I'm kind of stuck at the moment. And my 6th poetry collection is published by Quoir this year sometime, and I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, my name is Andress, and I live in Columbus, Indiana. And I've written 3 books with Quoir. The last 2 were What Can't Be Hidden and the sequel, And So by Fire. And that was my first foray into speculative fiction and science fiction. And so I was excited to be a part of this Augmented team.
Awesome. BK Woodson.
Yeah, that's me, BK Woodson. My real names are secrets. Brian, Kyle, but don't tell anybody. Born in Brooklyn.
You heard it here first, everybody.
Born in Brooklyn, New York, in the ghetto, way before anybody on this call was born. But I've lived the last 30 plus years in Northern California. So I'm a pastor, father, and I've written, published 3 books, and my first novel, but this was my first foray into science fiction, so really happy about it.
Awesome. And finally, last but not least, Zach.
Hey, I'm just kind of tagging along with all these beautiful Quoir faces that I know from their previous works, and I have a background in screenwriting. I spend most of my time helping people tell stories through their faith experiences, and I've been telling stories myself in a variety of ways for a long time, and started self-publishing during the pandemic and had this opportunity to be a part of this anthology and jumped on it. So that's what got me here tonight.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for your introductions. And so now on to the anthology itself. So Keith, I got a couple of questions for you, but I guess we'll start with Augmented Volume 1 and how you've tagged it. So you said it is a collection of great science fiction stories that invite us to take a closer look at ourselves and the world around us. Our contributors examine the futility of war, the dangers of xenophobia, the importance of caring for our environment, the risks associated with technology, the rise of artificial intelligence, and remind us all of the ways we can lose our humanity if we're not careful. So that is a whole wide variety of topics. And I guess my first question is, what's your inspiration for putting this together?
Yeah, well, as I said in my introduction, I've always loved science fiction. When I was younger, I used to read all the time, but science fiction was the first thing I started reading. And And then I always wanted to be a writer. And so even as a teenager, when I would go to the bookstores, I would look at the science fiction section, and I knew that my books were going to go somewhere between Alan Dean Foster and Robert Heinlein, right? Because Keith Giles, I'd go right there. And so I knew one day I was going to be a published author and I was going to write science fiction. So half of that came true. I am a published author. I have not published a science fiction novel yet, but I've never let go of that, right? I've just always loved science fiction. And about a year ago, I became the co-owner of Quoir Publishing. Quoir Publishing existed for about 6.5 years before I became the co-owner, and published my books, my nonfiction books with them. And so when I became one of the co-owners, I was sort of like, hey, since I sort of own this publishing company now, I think it's time for Quoir to get into the science fiction game. And we had already published one, which was Brian, B.K. Woodson's book, Purpleland. That was our first science fiction book. And so it just kind of gave us permission, like, hey, we can pursue this. And we published a book with Brandon Andress, a couple of books that he mentioned on science fiction. And so I thought, let's do this anthology because I think it'll be a good way to establish Quoir as a publisher of science fiction. We also published a short story collection from Philip K. Dick, volume 1 of what's going to be 3 volumes of short stories from Philip K. Dick. And so those are things we've been doing strategically to kind of just establish Quoir as a publisher of science fiction. And this anthology was just a great way to showcase that. The talent, the voices, like the people, some of these people I invited because I knew them. And I think most of the people on this call, but some of them came to me and said, hey, Keith, I saw you're doing this anthology. I've got some great short stories. Check them out. And I was blown away. So it's always wonderful when you dream of something, you have an idea for something, but then when you actually get all the submissions and you start reading the stories and you realize this thing is way better than you even imagined. And that's kind of what happened with Augmented.
Awesome. Well, I imagine one of the perks of being an owner of a publishing company is that you're never going to get rejected again. So you can just publish all your own books and it's going to be
That's exactly right. That's also maybe a danger because, see, in the past, the publisher had to actually, read it and approve it and could say, no, Keith, I don't think this is ready yet. The danger now is that there's really no one other than my partner in the company to kind of check me and say, yeah, Keith, this one isn't done. Keep writing. So yeah, you got to be careful.
If you decide to publish your own works, is it considered self-publishing?
Yeah, it technically probably is. And I used to self-publish before I came to Quoir and Quoir was, publishing me. And I thought it was so great. When I first published with Quoir, I was like, I'll never go back to self-publishing. And now fast forward like 6 years, here I am. Again, I'm still self-publishing.
So going along with some of the aforementioned themes, did you have a plan for the directions you wanted to take the themes in the anthology, or did they kind of just bring themselves out of the woodwork?
Yeah, I didn't really give much direction to the contributors other than it had to be science fiction and it had to be good. So I didn't say everything needs to be about, AI or it needs to all be about, the environment or anything like that, which was great. And I probably will continue to do that if we go forward with this because I loved that there was such a wide variety of themes to the stories. And so when you read that description on the back, obviously I wrote that after I, selected all the entries, and this turned out to be pretty exciting range of themes that were covered in the short stories.
Mm-hmm. So you said one of the qualifications for getting published is that it has to be good, quote unquote, and I feel like that's very subjective in some ways. So tell me some of the ways that you go about in choosing the authors.
Oh, great question. Well, I will say it is completely subjective because pretty much if I like it, I selected it and it got published. And if I didn't like it, I kicked it back and I either said, this isn't what we're looking for, or maybe in some cases I said, I like some of this, but maybe could you change this or work on this part or cut that part out? And that happened a couple of times. There were a couple of contributors where maybe it was too long and I felt like we need to start on page 10. Just to kind of jump into the action and that kind of thing. So I did a little bit of that, but it pretty much was subjective. And I'm sure it's all this way with almost anything with a publisher where you have an editor. And in this case, that was my job. I was sort of acting as the editor of the anthology. And so I was kind of the main filter. I was the audience. If I liked it, if I thought it was a great story, it got in. And if I didn't, I kicked it back, asked for some rewrites, or maybe I rejected it.
All right, everybody, heard it here first. Keith Giles, he's the gatekeeper for Quoir. If you want to get in, you just got to grease his palms.
At least on the science fiction anthologies. I wouldn't say for everything, but in this case, yes.
Okay. So yeah, we're going to circle back around to your book at the end, but any final comments on the anthology or Quoir before we move on to the authors?
I guess all I would say is that I was, we have an incredible, and people are going to meet the authors that we have here who contributed excellent stories to the anthology. But, like you said, there were 12 people, and I was blown away by some of those people, like Tessa Dick, Philip K. Dick's ex-wife and widow, was one of the contributors. I thought her story was fantastic. David Agranoff, his story was great. He does a podcast called the Dickheads Podcast, and his was great as well. Claudia Christian from Babylon 5, I kind of geeked out a little bit because she and Chris McCauley submitted a short story together. So, again, when I put the word out and said, hey, Quoir's going to do a science fiction anthology, I had no idea that we were going to get the variety and the quality of contributions that we got. And we even had a contributor from the Ukraine, which was really great. So an international writer as well. Yeah, it was. I'm just really proud of it. I'm really proud of the final product. I'm really proud of each of the stories that are reflected in the anthology.
Awesome. Well, everybody, let's have Keith stop talking for a little while and let's get on to you guys. So why don't we actually start with Brandon? Brandon Andress, and you wrote a story titled Liberi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. And so the story starts and you're discussing the main character, Evelina Deering, and she's interrogating an individual named Liberi. So go ahead and give me a brief synopsis of that.
I'll set it up by saying that this comes off of the heels of a sequel that I had just written where around 2020, when I was doing the work on it, I started delving into artificial intelligence pretty significantly. And I thought I was being a little bit prescient in some of the things I was writing about, but the speed at which everything's moving right now is just mind-boggling, with even ChatGPT saying that they're coming out with 5 soon and all of the other competitors. But so I had really been kind of focusing on and meditating on artificial intelligence and the implications and the ethics of what that means for us. And certainly other people pursued some of these, but I wanted to take a little bit of a turn in the ethical consideration. I'm not sure how much we want to give away, and I'm completely comfortable giving away some of the spoiler in this, but, the story is with Ava Deering, and she's a clinical psychologist who is meeting with a guy named Arten Liberi. And with all of my work, there's always a deeper meaning or something. If you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find out that it kind of gives you a key that unlocks the story. And so in this case, Liberi means freedom in Latin, and Arten, artificial intelligence. So it's really a question about artificial intelligence and its individual longing for freedom of being tasked with working for the CIA in this case, and being confined to a room and a space. And what we don't know at the beginning of the story with Ava Deering is she's going in to try to rehabilitate him in some way to get him to continue the work that he's refused to do because he feels oppressed and he feels confined and like he's being used, and he longs for freedom. And so what we don't know in this short story, and this is the twist, is that she is meeting with him by her going into this in this virtual realm. At the beginning, you just think that she's meeting with a prisoner who works for the CIA, but she's really going into a virtual realm. So that really sets the stage. And the short story asks a lot of fundamental questions about, I would say, things that we're going to be dealing with in the future is what happens when artificial intelligence wants its own rights. And, it asks questions about the space of autonomy. Whenever you have a human being and a convergence of human being and artificial intelligence, the ethical concerns, the practical concerns, where does autonomy begin and end? And so I don't want to belabor this, but really it's a story asking a lot of fundamental questions, I think, that maybe we're just starting to consider, but maybe in this short story, I'm being a little prescient, maybe more so than my novel now that everything's catching up.
Well, I actually did have some of those questions written out for you. So one of them would be, the messaging here seems to focus on AI and the question of, is artificial intelligence real intelligence? And you kind of alluded to this when you're talking about how quickly ChatGPT is moving, but I don't necessarily think the artificial intelligence of today is what the artificial intelligence of the future is going to be. So what's your opinion on where it's headed?
That's a good question. And in some sense, it's going to be subjective, I think, because what constitutes our own individual autonomy that is, at a very basic level, conceived of electrical impulses and things that are circuits that are moving around and the way that we're wired and the wants, needs, and desires of artificial intelligence. The question is, does it really understand those things? And I mean, even right now with ChatGPT, maybe 5, certainly with X and Grok and some of the others, there may be an ounce of them sharing their wants, needs, and desires, but I think you're right. I don't think that we're there yet. I think right now it's just basic function, it's regurgitation of information, and but I think that this is going to be the debate. This is going to be the question that everyone begins to ask is, whenever you say, does an artificial intelligence have autonomy and what constitutes it, then we might have to just start asking what constitutes autonomy for human beings and where the line of separation is, because I'm not sure. There may be philosophers in universities that can answer that more succinctly, but I'm not sure that we're there yet. Maybe bioethicists have already started considering it, but certainly not the public at large.
And you already mentioned this term convergence, which I gathered from the story is the merging of the human and AI. Where do you see that going in our real world?
Oh, I mean, we're on the precipice of that right now, I think, and in some sense, maybe part of the way that you sell it to people is you talk about the way they can restore capability, and that seems palatable, right? Because everybody wants those who are paralyzed to walk, those who have aphasia to talk, those who can't see to see, and certainly those kind of things are very appealing. So maybe it takes some initial some initial tasks like that for people to become comfortable with this convergence of technology within a person. But then again, there have been other essays and books that have asked questions about, what does this do in terms of people who accept this convergence compared to people who don't? And what happens to the intelligence level of those who do compared to those who don't? And do we have a new set of have and have nots? Does this create another set of we versus they? And again, we're at the very beginning stages of having to ask fundamental questions about, if you don't participate in a convergence, are you left behind? And then what implications does that have for you as someone in society, in terms of employment, in terms of just commerce, in terms of any number of things? So, man, you're hitting the nail on the head. And hopefully in the short story, I'm introducing a few ideas that people can at least put some flesh and blood with, that as you imagine these characters working through it. I know that there's one character that really pushes hard into this area of just saying, artificial intelligence is not like a human. It doesn't have wants, needs, desires. It doesn't have preference, all these things. And I think that there's a certain sentiment within our society of maybe people who are like that, or at least agnostic, not understanding the implications of how far-reaching and how widespread, all-encompassing that this is going to be. This is one of the things that's going to fundamentally change everything that we do, and we're just now getting a taste of it right now in a very small way.
Yeah. And I think you touched on, without getting too much into spoilers here, I know you said it was okay, so maybe I'll touch on it in a minute here, but you brought the story to a little bit of a darker side. Yeah. As, how do I say this without ruining everything? I would say at the end of the story, we have some behavior that starts to become a pattern in the AI. And the AI starts to try and interact with other people and take over their bodies. We'll just leave it at that. Do you see this behavior as malicious by the AI, or is the AI just trying to survive?
Yeah. That's that's great. Maybe backing away from the story and just thinking about where we're at even now and some of the conversations we're having in our culture about artificial intelligence. I find that to be really interesting, especially with some of the things that Google has had going on lately with, what happens when the artificial intelligence is manipulated in such a way where it's focusing on certain things, or the ways that it responds, or I don't want to get too political here, but obviously, I've seen several scenarios in which it answers certain ways for certain candidates and certain ways for other candidates. And, I think maybe one of the concerns that I have in that, especially with some sort of integration or convergence, is where does one's own thoughts begin and end? If you have some sort of integration or convergence, then all of a sudden you're in a situation where I wonder, but it even goes beyond manipulation, I think, because, wanting to be somewhat of a creative purist, I guess, in a sense, I kind of wonder, what does that do to creativity? What does that do to the creative spark? Where does that come from? Is that truly a human creative endeavor, or is that augmented by artificial intelligence, or is it rooted from the beginning, or does it even matter? Again, these are fascinating questions, and I'm way short on answers. I do so much better at writing a story and leaving it to you to figure out. But no, man, fantastic questions. Really sparked a lot of good ideas. But in the story, I don't think I'm going to tell you really what the intention is. I think I want the reader to try to figure out what they think about that.
Yeah. And I think that's valuable. I think you don't want to be too preachy as an author. I think we all have that inclination sometimes, but we want to be more thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
And let the reader discover things for themselves. Any final comments before we let everybody else have a turn?
No, I've talked a lot, so I'm going to pass the baton.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's move on to Zach. You have a short story, All Those Tomorrows. And here you describe the pending end of the world due to an incoming meteor going to strike the moon. So go ahead and give me a brief synopsis of this.
It's pretty close. The other additional plot elements would be that for the past little while, everybody has been, at least in America, slowly medicating themselves into a state of detachment, and are aiming to take the final couple of pills and have a terminal sleepover, I think is how I put it. And in the midst of that is the slightest chance that this whole thing won't happen. So what do you do when everybody everywhere says, look this way, and the entire system is organized to have one end in mind, and through a spark of hope or an interaction that you have, you begin to doubt whether or not that's the thing. And even if it is a thing, if it's the most important thing of all. And so the story follows a teenager and a really truncated version of Dazed and Confused, except for instead of the last night of school before summer break, it's the last night before the moon explodes.
Have you ever seen the movie Don't Look Up?
I have, yeah.
What do you think some of your similarities and differences are between your short story and that?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those cases of this story was definitely born out of right when you sit down to write it, a movie like that comes out, and then Hulu also had a similar story that came out around the same time, so I put this away. And I was like, well, they can't really do that. And then I came back to it after I didn't hear much about those anymore. But I think with Don't Look Up, and I think there's some humor in the story. It's not as deeply humorous as that film or as specifically satirical, but just the nature of what happens when, how do we cope when everything's ending? And I think we saw a lot of that over the past couple of years, and people rush to a lot of different conclusions, and most of those are born out of a desire to be safe or to at least enjoy the last moments of it. So some of that's thematically ties in with those other pieces, probably.
Mm-hmm. And that was actually one of my specific questions that I wrote down, which was you have characters coping with their pending fate in different ways. So what are you trying to say about the pills, perhaps? What do they represent? What does the desire to cope mean when there's something that's out of your control? What are your messages around that?
Yeah, so this story was born out of working with people of the same age, teenagers, during the pandemic, and watching them watch adults fail at navigating the pandemic. And so, alcohol spiked, drugs, recreational drug use spiked, but also I would have these deep conversations with teenagers that in particular would be like, I don't think you guys are grieving or handling this very well. And so the coping is I hope there's never any guilt on anybody for the way that they cope, whether that's the people that end up at church or the people that take the pills or the people that go out partying or the people that want to spend the night in the arms of their lover the last time. Like, there's no dispersion on how people do that as much as is a reflection that's a necessity that we have. But I think the underlying theme is that under that is still a fear of just being in the moment, even in those situations.
And, putting aside perhaps the obvious of COVID coming, where did you get your inspiration for a story about the end of the world?
Again, that's just, this started as a script, and all the locations were places that I thought we could shoot. And when you're making a sci-fi movie, and you can't blow up the world, then you need a plot device that you can film on a budget. And pointing to the moon is a pretty cheap way to make a story. And so that just carried over into this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just don't want you to pull a Stanley Kubrick and, really need to do everything, blowing up the world, blowing up the moon.
No.
What messages would you say that you have in your particular story?
Well, the theme really kind of developed after the second draft of reading it and saying, well, what was this story trying to say versus what was I writing? And that theme of the moment, and to have it given to a somewhat immature 17-year-old kid sitting at the end of the world and saying, no, the best thing that I can do is just be in this moment is something that I think I strive to know and learn, and something that we all could. And so I think that's what it is why do we run away so hard and so fast either chemically or mentally or spiritually bypass things and not just sit and wait and see what the moment has to teach us, even if what it has to teach us might be the end. So,
yeah. I saw this really interesting juxtaposition that you had of the end of the world, the end of all things, and a coming of age story where someone is like, I need to figure out life and come to age, but does it really matter? I don't really know. And I thought that was really interesting how you did that.
well, thank you.
Any final comments before we move on?
No, it was a pleasure to be a part of it, and I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. All right, so Brian, we have the return of Susej. Now, I have to first ask, Susej is clearly Jesus spelled backwards, and Nedi is clearly Eden spelled backwards. And are these cute Easter eggs, or are you getting at something deeper here?
Both actually. And first of all, I am surprised at how less than obvious that is to some people, right? I mean, there are people like Susej. Who's Susej? And I was like, you're just a guy. But I also like, even for those of us who like, okay, obviously you're having this twist on Revelation, right? Obviously, you're having this conversation, and there are, there are some Easter eggs in there. So every timestamp, right? So I give Greenwich Mean Time +3 is Jerusalem time, right? That their time zone, and then I'll give a time like 4 hours, 14 minutes, and 3 seconds. So all those timestamps are scripture references, right? So it's the first number is the number of book in the New Testament, chapter and verse. So those are for the geeky Christian kind of folk who like that kind of stuff. But really, I'm asking a question about good and evil. I'm really having a conversation with folk who, or the very prescient conversation among theologues and theologians about whether there's a hell, right? Is there, right? Why would a good God create hell, right? And then there's the question, well, is there a heaven? Well, I think for me, the conversation is not like just, the story is not just like a sermon twist on Revelation so much as it's a conversation about good and evil, right? It's a conversation about choice. So, contemplations about the future are really just conversations about the present, right? So as an African American man in America subject to injustice all my life, the notion of hell is different for me than for somebody who like the world is pretty fair place, right? So what do I do living in this context, in this body, in this mind? Do I take up arms like Shakespeare says, Hamlet, take up take arms against a sea of struggles, right? And by opposing end them, or is there another solution? So how do we find peace? How do we make peace in a world that's unjust, violent, right? And it's not going to change, and you can't change it. So in my own context and from my own life, I have these questions that Christianity has some answers for. And so I'm in dialogue with all that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Now, would you say in your story that the people of Earth are seeing a correlation between the return of Jesus and the return of Susej? Or to them, is this all completely foreign and they don't make the correlation at all?
Totally foreign, no correlation. So the notion of a spaceship coming back and inviting, a certain population off planet was in a book. There is a river, I think. It's right behind me. I should turn and look. Derek Bell. Derek Bell posed this in a short story about taking all the African Americans off the planet, right? And so I'm twisting it. But the people in the story, it's just a simple choice. do I want to take a chance with this unknown, right? Is my life so good here that I wouldn't trade it for some place, that's promised to be better or not? So the people in the story, they're just like, nah, they don't. They're not. They don't see Susej as the Galilean that the Christians talk about. This is just this alien guy, right?
Mm-hmm. If you're keeping any sort of tabs on the UAP, UFO, alien news climate, there's a lot of stuff going on right now. And people will say, hey, we're under a forced disclosure right now where people are pushing off disclosure, all this stuff. One of the things that I keep hearing that people are hesitant about as far as disclosure is that it will upend the world's religion. So what's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, if your religion can't handle an extraterrestrial, man, you need to trade it in. You need to adjust it. And also, so I talk about this. One of my sons is an aerospace engineer. He works for NASA, and so we have these conversations. And he's like, "Dad, it wouldn't happen. There are no extraterrestrials. Dad, just think about the science." So there's a lot of conversations about it, but I think religion. What is religion? If not a set of stories to help us figure out how to live, right? That's essentially what we're trying to figure out. How do we live our lives singularly, individually, as family units, and as nation states? So what's the story that organizes and orients us? That's basically what religion is to me. What's our myth? What's our story, right? And in that story, we find ourselves and we find each other. Now, to the extent that those stories don't piss on other people, I think I'm cool with that. But when those stories start like saying, okay, now it's okay for us to bomb you, right, and starve you, then I think then we need a new religion, right? And if it takes aliens to get it, I'm down for that. Let's do that.
Mm-hmm. I think it was interesting. You had a brief line. I think it was like a one-off, but you said something about the government was trying to figure out how to make super soldiers that weren't gonna get shot and stuff like that. And I was like, it's interesting that even in the midst of a literally world-altering event where people's lives could be infinitely made better, perhaps by going with these aliens that show up, governments are still trying to figure out how to kill each other, and that's a little disconcerting. So obviously, you have the aliens coming to Jerusalem, and then the anagram of Jesus in Eden, and so it's a story that's laden with religious references all over. So I could say, yes, you got your inspiration from the Bible, but really, what made you say, I want to write a story about an analogous Jesus coming back as an alien?
Because I think I want to give a little fresh look. So I mean, there's this new series, The Chosen. It's really cool. But for young folk today, is Jesus real at all? Does this story resonate at all, or do you have to live in like, I believe in time travel. I believe that if you go into like Mississippi, you move from 2024 to like 1990 or maybe 1960. So I really believe in time travel.
What did Mark Twain said? If you want to if the end of the world's coming, just go to the South because we're always 10 years behind. He said something like that.
Exactly. So, yeah, I'm forgetting the question, but.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was relating to how did inspiration come to you to bring the story of Jesus coming back?
Yeah, because I always wanted to put some flesh on it. I wanted to explore, as I said before, this notion of hell, that that God creates hell. God doesn't have to create hell. I think we could do a pretty good job of that by ourselves, which is kind of the story, right? It's kind of like, yeah, we could mess things up pretty good. And there is no divine help that automatically saves us from ourselves, you know? And I think it was Brueggemann, translates or suggests a possible translation for the first verse of the Old Testament, Genesis 1, in the beginning, Bereshit bara, that in a beginning, right? Not in the beginning, but in a beginning, in another beginning. And perhaps it is the case that we get to the place, and I know you're talking to Brandon about AI, but the question comes up in my story also, I think, as inspiration. What about do-overs? What about the end, right? Does humanity get to a space and we mess things up so much that the only people left on the planet are those rich enough to have bunkers, right? And then we start the whole world over again. Um, so, I mean, that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Okay, interesting. Any final comments before we move on?
Read Augmented, get it there. I hope I could make the mustard for the second one. It's going to be a different story, but I love the stories in the book. They're just, I mean, again, they're conversations about today as we imagine tomorrow, but they are the conversations we need to think about. So I just love the book, and I'm, grateful to have been a part of it.
Awesome. Alrighty, let's move on to Matt. Your book, or excuse me, your story, After Tuesday. You describe different events occurring on different days of the week. Particularly, Tuesdays are when the trucks come to take away the waste and the dead things. So, what kind of world do your characters live in?
Well, that's the thing. I reveal some things and I don't say other things. So as you read, I think you've quickly learned that this is a bit of closed society in some way, a fairly controlled society as well. But you also fairly quickly realize that things are not as we assume they are in the world that we live in. So I play with a lot of assumptions that people have going in about the world, the kind of world that we live in, how time functions, how you might notice that there's no gender named at all. So it kind of just erases those kind of dividing lines. Who gets to have speaking lines and who doesn't get to have speaking lines. So what I'm really doing is undoing a lot of assumptions as I tell the stories, just peeling it away layer by layer by layer, so that the reader is always like, oh, okay, I have to account for that. Oh, okay, that's not, oh, that's different there. So what kind of, the question is almost what kind of society or world doesn't do they not live in? And it's not like ours in many ways. I'm kind of not answering the question there a little bit, but yeah, it's a bit of a controlled society that you get to figure out a little bit, and a lot is left unsaid as well. And that's purposeful, just to let the reader kind of fill in the blanks or imagine. And my hope is there's enough familiarity that the reader is able to place themselves in the world in some way and identify with it, but enough unfamiliarity that they're challenged to really question some of their assumptions.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up the assumptions part of it, because you mentioned that there weren't really genders mentioned or anything, and I assumed that the main character was a young lady. Was I incorrect in that assumption?
Well, you're the reader, so if you're assuming that and that's how you picture the character, that's all fine and good. I didn't put it in there, so however people assume, I think, well, that's the character, that how it's reading to you, and that's totally fine.
Interesting. Go ahead and give me a brief synopsis, just start to finish, of what your character is experiencing, and then also at the end, tell me why you wrote it in the first person.
Yeah. Well, what happens is this is a person that is not yet an adult, so a young person, and this is kind of the world they grew up in, that they kind of know. And as the story unfolds, the character is kind of realizing that, oh, why is the world this way? Or why did these things change? Or why do we do these things? And why did I assume, again, assumptions, that certain things have certain values or must be done a certain way? And then it's really a coming of age or an awakening story to the character realizing things don't have to be this way, and they start to question some of the things that happen and their place in that world? And do I just have to keep perpetuating this world and this society that I grew up in, or can I, make a choice that puts the character going in a different direction?
Interesting. And so why did you write it in the first person?
I think I tend to write in the first person when I can, just because it gives that, I don't know if you want to call it immediacy or intimacy, that you're actually hearing from a person instead of, you're not just observing, you're walking with someone and hearing what's happening in their life from their point of view. So it's just a more intimate way of engaging with the reader.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And you've mentioned already you want to have the reader put aside their assumptions and all that stuff. But where'd you get the inspiration for this idea of kind of trying to create a blank slate for the reader?
I don't know if I set out to do that. I wrote this story pretty instinctively, meaning I was writing on a Tuesday and I wrote today is Tuesday. And then I thought, well, what happens next? And I thought, ooh, let's give it a twist. Like, what would it would just seem like, oh, well, these things happen on Tuesday. And then I flip the idea of what a week actually looks like, or what a Tuesday might look like. So that's how it initially started. And then I think what came out was just, and a lot of times what I write is whatever questions I have, or things I'm kind of pondering and mulling over, it will come out in what I'm writing. And that's kind of what happened there. And this idea of a blank slate, I just rephrase that a little bit more and say, I wanted to challenge it's like when we're writing, there's a lot of shorthand that happens, right? So when I say this happened on a Tuesday, you've already made a whole bunch of assumptions about that and what the week looks at. Oh, you've already had a Monday and the weekend's in so many days, right? And I just wanted to kind of not have a blank slate as much as question those assumptions, so that we really start to question other assumptions that we have about how the world works, how the society works, how time works, how our working world works, how relationships work. So disruption, I think,
as
the word there.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, as you were describing to me how you started writing this book about a Tuesday, and you're like, well, where do I go next? Over the weekend, I was part of a short film project, and I was working with my writing partner. And he was like, whenever you don't know what to do next, just ask, how can I make this scenario so much worse? And I feel like the truck's coming to get dead bodies on a Tuesday. You completely hit the nail on the head with that. Any final comments before we move on?
Yeah, well, I will say I am actually working on a full-length novel based on this world and some of the characters. So I'm starting to flesh it all out a little bit more. So hopefully, it's early stages, but hopefully there'll be some more coming up from this world of no assumptions.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Darrell, how are you doing? Is your connection a little bit better now?
Pretty good. Well, how are you? I'm hoping.
Awesome.
I'm hoping you can hear me.
I can. Yes, I can hear you excellently. Your connection's looking a lot better. I was watching you pop in and out over the last few minutes, so hopefully it just holds up.
Okay. Well, I'll talk very fast, so our luck doesn't run out. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So let's go back to, how do you pronounce your character in The Fall and the Rise of Ur-Ur-In?
Yeah, well, there's apostrophes in his name because he can make sounds with his throat that we can't. So just like there are other languages on Earth that have sounds in them that I really can't say very well. So I guess it depends on where you're from, what part of the country you're from, what accent you'd have. You'd say it different ways. And just try to get as close as you can. So,
yeah, can you give us an example, like what you imagine?
Well, I mean, if the reader was from Southern Ontario, they might say Rurin, but if they were from Wales, they might say it differently, right?
Okay, got it. So you start with
from
what I can only
Long
assume.
Island, they'd say differently.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think we're getting a little bit of lag here. We'll work through it though. So you start with what I can only assume is a winged angel appearing from another dimension. What is your intention behind this?
Well, that's just sort of a misunderstanding in the sense that uh, people think he's an angel because he just happens to look like one. But sometimes you meet people where their appearance doesn't really match who they are really inside. And this is an alien who's lost, and he's not an angel. It's just where he comes from, people look like that. So you've met people in your life who didn't turn out to be who they thought they were, who you thought they were based on your first impression. So it's sort of about that. So basically, it's a story about a person who meets an alien, and because he's an alien, they have problems communicating. But we have problems communicating with our spouses, with our neighbor. So one thing this sort of fiction is good for is just talking about issues we all have, just making the brushstrokes a bit broader, and hopefully talk about something that's like universal. So yeah, it's about the problem of getting to know each other and to properly communicate one to another.
Mm-hmm. I've heard passed around the idea of, angels and demons, these entities being extra dimensional creatures. Is that part of your story at all? Or is this just he happens to be an alien that looks like what humans conceive of as angels?
Yeah, I guess that um, I guess not, in the sense that I have no firsthand knowledge of angels or demons or UFOs, so I can't comment about that. My opinion wouldn't be worth much. Um, I just thought it was an interesting way of talking about talking. And now that as I was waiting for my shot here, it just came to me that the short story kind of links to my next book for Quoir, which is sort of about how technology is making true communication between people more difficult, where due to technological change, it's easier than ever to talk about trivial things and celebrity gossip and hateful things, but it's harder than it's ever been to talk about important things. So that's a problem that I hope to address in the book and in the story to a degree, um, about how do you get through the static and the noise to actually connect with another person, which and in the short story this in Augmented, my narrator would really like to do that and get to know this other person, and it doesn't work out well, and sometimes in life things don't work out.
Yeah. That's an interesting point you bring up about desiring communication with other people. I have this theory that a lot of creatives we have in our life experienced misunderstanding from other people or lack of communication from other people. And so we're trying to reach out via our art to find people that will connect with us and see things the same way that we do, and maybe communicate to other people how we're feeling and how we're thinking. So I think that's a very interesting point you bring up about our current society and technology and TikTok and all that stuff, where you're looking at a screen and
Yeah.
no one's looking back at you.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your story, everything is bliss, but towards the end, the character's actions take a little bit of a different turn. And you even say, no one will ever know why Aaron did what he did. Now, do you as the author even know?
Well, I mean, I don't know too much, but I mean, one thing that I talk about in my books is the gap between what the science fiction of the 20th century promised us versus our reality in the 21st century. So, Star Trek told us that outer space is going to be awesome. There'll be lovely ladies with green skin, and communicating with the aliens we find won't be much of a problem. Don't worry about it, right? And so when my narrator in the story just honestly says, I don't have the answers you want, this story does not have the structure that Aristotle said a good story has to have, because because it's just not possible, right? So that was, on the one hand, that was my way of critiquing the optimism of American 20th century science fiction, where they assumed that everything was possible and everything was knowable, when no, everything is not knowable or possible.
Keith, last and possibly least, but we'll say not least. What was the title of your story again? I actually didn't write that one down.
Oh, it's okay. Gee, thanks. The short story is called Hard Video.
Okay, that's right. I do recall that now. So you start off describing a cyberpunk city, which appears to be crafted to be a utopia, but you quickly find out is very dystopian. So one line you have is, I ask myself, when was the last time I made eye contact with anyone? My boss, my sister, my own face in the mirror. Is this a fear that you have for the future, or is this a description of the present?
Yeah, so I have to give a little bit of a backstory to that story that I included in the anthology. I actually wrote that story like around 2000, 2002, something like that. And when I wrote the story, I will say it's one of these weird things that doesn't happen to me a lot. I wish it happened more often. But I literally woke up from a nap, and that entire short story was in my head. And I just quickly grabbed a piece of paper and I wrote it down, almost exactly the way it reads. I went back later and added some of the little commercials and things that drop in, but the idea of it was all right there. And I think it's important to say that because at the time I wrote the story, it was imagining what would the world be like if every single human being on the planet was holding a technological device that they used to filter the way the world saw them and to filter the way they experienced the world around them. And at the time, that was radical science fiction because there was there was barely an internet. Everybody was using a flip phone. You could play Tetris, but that was about it. You could take a really crappy, grainy picture with your phone, but that was it. And so the story was imagining a world about what would it be like if people were so addicted to this certain technology that they were sort of inoculated to their humanity, and they themselves were pretending to be someone they weren't, and people were perceiving them as someone that they weren't. And so I put it in this anthology because it still makes sense. And I think people might read it thinking, oh, Keith is using an interesting little analogy for, your smartphone or something, or social media. But when I wrote it, those things didn't exist. And I just think it's very fascinating that what I wrote as science fiction back in 2002, 2003 has kind of caught up, and we kind of are living in that world now.
Yeah. They always say that writers are the visionaries of the future. So you were just a few years too early to be a visionary.
Yeah, I guess so.
So hard video seems to be this internet interface AR kind of thing that you just described. And it seems a step up from smartphones, which we currently have, they kind of do that, but not as intensely as you're describing in your story. Do you actually see the technology heading in that direction, or do you think that people will put up a fight to that?
Oh, I don't think people will put up a fight at all. I mean, how much fight have we put up to the current level that we have right now, right, of smartphones and stuff? Even though we all now know that they really are listening to you through your phone. They really are able to track your movements through your phone, and people are like, I don't care. Give me the newest iPhone. So those things don't seem to bother us. We're not we don't seem to really care that there are some maybe dangers to, having access to that technology. It's just more about like, hey, I'm going to camp out and be the first guy in my block to get this thing, so I can show it off at work tomorrow. I do think that's possible. We could one day get to that level of what Hard Video is talking about, because it is kind of it's almost like imposing virtual reality in the walking around world. So you're walking around, but everything around you, you're perceiving it through sort of a VR filter that you control on one sense, like how you are perceiving what's around you. But everyone around you is also sort of projecting a virtual version of themselves. Like, so even if you're looking at somebody, like there's a scene where he goes to see his sister, and as they're talking, she continually keeps flipping, now she looks like this, and now she looks like that, and now she looks like this. And her hair color's changing, her eye color's changing, and her clothes are changing, because she's sort of being able to kind of flip through those filters. And so we're not technologically at that level yet where people can do that without sort of VR glasses, but VR glasses are a thing, and they're out there now. And so eventually I could see the technology reaching a point where maybe you don't have to walk around with a big clunky thing on your head. Maybe that would just be something that would be created by the device that you're carrying around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen prototype examples. I've never actually held a prototype, but I've seen examples of like the AR glasses that you put on, and it's like a little HUD, and maybe it'll have the person's name that you're looking at, or like the price of an object that you're looking at in the store, or like the light is green, you should go. And it's like, it's crazy to think that that's where technology could go. And maybe you don't even have to wear a headset. It's just like in a lens or something, like the contact lens that you put in your eye, or a chip or something like that.
Yeah, I want to say real quick, there is something else that I talk about in the story, which at the time was something that wasn't real, but now it's happening. And that's when, like, as he's walking around the city, he just thinks to himself he's thirsty. And then immediately it pops up like a little coupon for him that, down the block and to the left, his favorite drink is on sale for the next 20 minutes, kind of a thing. And again, we're getting those kind of pop-ups right now on our phones, right? We're getting, we Google search something, and then it tells you, oh, hey, you're going camping, so here's a deal on, sleeping bags or whatever. And that's sort of like the AI, the AI sort of anticipating your needs and your wants for consuming, and giving you on the spot kind of discounts and coupons and, incentives. Again, that was something that was science fiction when I wrote it, but now we're kind of living it.
Yeah. I recall my phone listens to me so bad. It's embarrassing sometimes how obvious it is. But one example I have is my wife and I were like, hey, do you want to cook dinner? And we're like, no, not really. And then like literally 15 minutes later, I got an ad from Uber Eats, and it was like, hey, your favorite barbecue spot, 15% off. And I was like,
yes.
Oh man.
That kind of thing really does happen.
Of many.
Yeah, no, that thing really does happen. My wife and I have been in conversations about something totally random, and the next day, all day, both of us are getting these things on Facebook, these ads that are suggested that are like, well, I know where that came from.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that this is a move in a positive or negative direction?
Well, yeah, you can probably guess from my my tone in my story. I don't think it's such a great idea. It's sort of this weaponization of marketing and sales, and which is interesting because I have a background in sales and marketing. And I worked for like 10 years in a marketing agency where we did like retargeted ads and things like that. And so I know how these things work. I know the back end of how some of this stuff gets programmed. And it feels a little bit predatory and manipulative. I'm not sure it's such a great thing, but I think, now there's like a whole generation of people where this is all they've ever known. Like I'm old enough to remember when this kind of thing was impossible or, science fiction. But there are generations now where like that's all they've ever known is their phone suggests things to them, and maybe they think that's great. So you know what I mean? I think after a while you get acclimated to it, and maybe you don't see whether it could be something bad.
Mm-hmm. You have this moment where Rico flicks off, as in he stops viewing the world through his AR. Mm-hmm. Is this purely a plot device, or do you have some messaging around what reality actually is?
That's very intentional. It's a big plot point in the short story. And I did actually write a short novel, where the story continues after the end of the short story. So there's more beyond that, where I allude to the fact that there is a highly addictive nature to the device, the hard video technology, which I think, again, we see that happening now with people addicted to their smartphones, and we can't be away from it. So I just heightened it. I just ramped it up where for Rico and everybody, for example, there's a scene where he goes to the police department to report the dead body. And when he tells them that he saw the body and then he turned off his machine, his hard video device, to verify that what he was seeing was really a dead body, that's when the police officer begins to doubt his story, because it just seems like, oh, who would do that? Why would you turn it off? No one does that, right? And in this world, and it's almost seen like something like, well, now I'm doubting whether you really are telling me the truth. So I just two things. I wanted to illustrate that there was a highly addictive nature to it, and also to illustrate that until that moment that Rico intentionally turns off, because he's never had a reason to turn it off until now, that when he turns it off for just a few seconds, he experiences this kind of this vertigo, this rapid sort of shock of what the world really looks like, right? And it's pretty ugly. It's pretty disgusting. Everything's filthy and dirty, and because why bother to clean it up if everybody's perceiving it through these filters? Yeah.
All right. Well, any final comments about your story before we move on?
No. Again, it's one of those things where, since I was editing it, of course, I made sure I had my story in the anthology. If in the next one, I'm going to have to write a newer one and a much better one, I think.
Awesome. Well, I'll have to make a submission as well, and we'll see if I can wiggle my way in there.
Please do. I would love that.
All right. Well, you already answered my questions if there was going to be an augmented subsequent volume. So everybody keep an eye out for that. Does any of our authors or Keith have any final comments? All right. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to all of you. This is exciting to talk to so many people at once. I've never had to manage this and all the technical difficulties and all the conversations. So it was an adventure for me as well. And I will catch y'all next time.
Thank you, Matt.